They did not build London upward in the early 19th century. They uncovered it from beneath something that should not have been there at all, because in the year 1816, entire streets appeared to sink into the earth, while others seemed to rise out of it, and official records quietly describe layers of mud so deep that doorways became basements overnight. Yet no storm, no flood, no natural explanation was ever fully accepted. And what makes this even more unsettling is that similar descriptions began to surface across the Atlantic at almost the exact same time, as if two continents were experiencing the same silent transformation without ever acknowledging it. In old American towns along the eastern seaboard, particularly in cities like Boston and New York, there are accounts of streets being razed, of buildings having their lower floors buried and repurposed, of windows turning into foundations. And yet the narrative always insists this was intentional, planned, part of progress. But when you compare the timelines, when you align the year 1816 with what historians call the year without a summer, something begins to fracture, because the environmental anomalies alone cannot explain why entire architectural layers disappeared beneath uniform depths of earth as if pressed down by an unseen force. Some believe this was the result of catastrophic climate disruption, triggered by volcanic activity that altered the atmosphere and caused widespread flooding and soil displacement. But that explanation struggles to account for the consistency of burial depths across distant cities. Others suggest that rapid urban development led to streets being artificially raised to combat sanitation issues, yet this would require a level of coordination and labor that leaves behind almost no detailed documentation, no transitional phases, no clear acknowledgement of the original street levels that vanished beneath the new ones. But there is another possibility, one that lingers quietly beneath the surface of both London and early American cities, that what we call construction was actually a form of recovery, that these cities were not being built for the first time but reoccupied after an event that erased their lower layers from view. And if that is true, then the mud was not simply debris, it was a boundary, a dividing line between two versions of history, one we are allowed to see, and one that remains buried just beneath our feet, waiting in the foundations of buildings that were never meant to be foundations at all. As researchers began to look closer at these buried layers, patterns started to emerge that were too consistent to dismiss, because in both London and across early American cities, the same architectural anomaly appeared again and again: entire rows of buildings with lower windows sealed off, doorways leading nowhere, staircases descending into solid earth as if time itself had been cut off mid-structure. And what is even more unsettling is that many of these buildings share design features that do not align with the official timeline of their construction, suggesting they were not newly built but inherited, repurposed, adapted to a surface that had already shifted. In cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, early photographs and sketches reveal structures with proportions that seem distorted, as if the ground level had changed after they were completed. And yet, historical explanations insist these were simply modifications for modernization. But the question remains, why would so many cities across different regions all require the same type of modification at the same time? And why is there so little documentation showing the transition from the old street level to the new one? Some believe this was part of a coordinated urban redesign, a response to sanitation crises and overcrowding, where entire streets were elevated to improve drainage and infrastructure. But that would mean thousands of buildings had to be altered simultaneously with incredible precision. And still no detailed engineering records fully describe such an undertaking. Others suggest that natural disasters may have buried these cities gradually through repeated flooding and sediment accumulation. Yet the uniformity of the buried layers challenges this idea, because natural processes rarely create such consistent and widespread effects across separate continents. But there is another possibility, one that becomes harder to ignore the deeper you look, that these structures were not originally designed for the world we see today, that they belong to an earlier system, a different phase of civilization that operated on principles we no longer understand. And when whatever event occurred around 1816 reshaped the surface of the Earth, these buildings were left partially submerged, forcing those who came after to adapt them rather than rebuild entirely. And if that is true, then what we are seeing in both London and the United States is not urban development, but a form of historical layering, where one civilization quietly settles on top of another, leaving only fragments of the previous world visible in the buried architecture beneath our streets. As this pattern spreads from city to city, the mystery deepens, because the more locations you compare, the less it looks like coincidence, and the more it begins to resemble a synchronized event that left identical scars across continents. And when you examine places like Chicago, St. Louis, and even parts of Washington, you find the same hidden layers, the same sealed entrances, the same suggestion that what we call ground level was once something entirely different. And yet the official story moves forward without pause, describing expansion, growth, progress, while quietly building over something that no one fully explains. In Chicago, there are records of entire streets being raised by several feet in the mid-19th century, with buildings lifted using mechanical jacks so life could continue beneath them. But what remains unclear is why so many of these buildings already appeared to have lower levels that were not originally intended to be underground. And in Washington, the early development of the Capitol shows structures that seem oversized for their supposed purpose, with foundations that extend far deeper than necessary, as if they were not foundations at all, but the visible remnants of something older that had been partially buried before the city was even formally established. Some believe these anomalies can be explained by rapid industrial expansion, by the need to modernize infrastructure quickly as populations surged. But that explanation begins to strain when the same architectural signatures appear in cities that developed independently, with no unified planning authority capable of orchestrating such precise and widespread changes. Others suggest that this was the result of a forgotten series of environmental catastrophes that reshaped the land in ways we have since normalized. Events that deposited massive amounts of sediment almost overnight, forcing survivors to adapt to a new surface without fully understanding what had happened. But there is another possibility, one that sits just beyond the edge of recorded history, that around the early 19th century there was a reset, not a complete erasure, but a partial one, where an older world was pushed down and a new narrative was built on top of it. And the evidence of that transition still exists in the buried floors of buildings, in the mismatched proportions of architecture, in the quiet inconsistencies that appear when you look closely enough. And if London and the United States both carry these same marks, then the question is no longer whether something happened, but how far that event reached, and whether the cities we know today are truly the first version of themselves, or only the visible layer of something much older that remains hidden just beneath the surface. As the theory begins to take shape, it forces a more unsettling question, not just about what happened to these cities, but about who inherited them. Because when you trace the early records of occupation in both London and the United States, there are gaps, sudden appearances of fully functioning districts, infrastructure that seems too advanced for its supposed time, and populations moving into spaces that appear already prepared, already structured, as if the role of those who arrived was not to build, but to adapt, to reinterpret what was left behind and reshape it into something that fit a new narrative. In parts of New York and Boston, early accounts describe buildings that required minimal construction, yet immediate modification. Entrances being raised, windows being sealed, lower corridors abandoned, and the explanation given is always practical, always framed as necessity. Yet it avoids addressing the deeper question of why those lower levels existed in the first place, and why they were so uniform across cities that had no direct connection in their planning or development. Some believe this was the aftermath of a forgotten disaster, that survivors simply used what remained because rebuilding from nothing would have been impossible. Others suggest that the rapid expansion of cities during this period created the illusion of inheritance, that in reality, everything was constructed quickly and imperfectly, leaving behind inconsistencies that we now misinterpret as something older. But there is another possibility, one that becomes harder to dismiss when you consider the scale and uniformity of these buried layers, that what we call early modern cities were built upon a pre-existing network, a civilization that operated on principles we no longer recognize, and when whatever event occurred around 1816 reshaped the surface, those who came after stepped into a world that was already partially formed, already structured in ways they could not fully explain, forcing them to adapt rather than create. And if that is true, then the mud that buried London streets and American foundations was not just an environmental aftermath, but a dividing line between two eras, one that we study and one that we have forgotten. And the deeper implication is not just that something was lost, but that the story we have been told about how these cities began may only describe the moment they were rediscovered, not the moment they were first built. And if the foundations beneath our feet belong to a different chapter of history, then the question that remains is not what was buried, but why it was never meant to be found again. And if the final layer of this mystery is not hidden in the ground, but in the silence that followed, then what matters is not only what was buried, but what was rewritten. Because after 1816, the narrative becomes remarkably consistent. Cities are described as rising, expanding, modernizing, yet almost never recovering, almost never adapting to a catastrophe that should have left a deeper mark in recorded memory. And instead of detailed accounts of destruction, we find simplified explanations, controlled descriptions, and a steady forward movement that avoids looking back at what may have been lost beneath the surface. In both London and across the United States, the same pattern repeats. Buried structures are accepted as basements, altered architecture is normalized, and over time, the memory of any previous level fades into assumption, into background detail, until it no longer feels unusual at all. And this gradual normalization may be the most significant clue of all, because it suggests not just a physical reset, but a cognitive one, a shift in how history itself is framed and understood. Some believe this was simply the natural progression of society, that as cities grew, they absorbed their past and reshaped it into something more efficient, leaving behind inconsistencies that we now interpret as mystery. Others suggest that the scale of change required a simplification of narrative, that the truth was too complex, too fragmented to preserve accurately, and so it was condensed into a version that could be easily accepted and taught. But there is another possibility, one that lingers in every sealed doorway and every buried window, that the reset was not only physical but intentional, that what happened around 1816 created a boundary not just in the landscape but in history itself, separating what came before from what would be remembered after. And if that boundary still exists beneath our cities, hidden in the layers we walk over every day, then the real question is not whether an older world once stood where we stand now, but whether fragments of it are still waiting to be uncovered, quietly preserved beneath the narrative we have accepted. And if one day those layers begin to surface again, not as isolated anomalies, but as a connected pattern that can no longer be ignored, then we may be forced to ask a question that changes everything. Were these cities ever truly built by us? Or did we simply inherit the remains of something far older, something deliberately buried, something that was never meant to be remembered?